Peter Patisteas has seen Melbourne's coffee culture unfold and mature from a front row seat. He grew up learning the art of coffee roasting at the time a very manual process from his father and uncle in the Griffiths Brothers roastery. After a foray into investment banking in London in the 90s, he decided to go straight to the source and see how coffee starts life on the plantations of Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania and Rwanda. And after a year of travelling Africa, he returned to Melbourne to settle into the family business. Today, if you ask him his job title, he'll say something like coffee roaster from sunny Mulgrave, Victoria, Australia. But he's actually now co-director of the OG Group, along with his brother-in-law, Chris Togias. While the words coffee and technology don't always fit into the same sentence, they do for Peter. He's passionate about refining and advancing the processes around coffee production from crop to cup, while also doing as much as possible to look after the people involved and the environment. Hi, my name's Tom Andronis, and with me is Dave Burchett, and we're very excited to welcome Peter Patisteas to the Coffee Lab. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks very much, Tom. Great introduction.
Thank you very much. Well, it's all about you, so it was pretty good. Take us to the lush green hillsides of Africa in the 90s. Why did you decide to go and see it for yourself, and what did you learn there?
The sad part about that is it was the 90s, and we're well and truly past that. But it was an interesting period of time because pre-mobile, you're on your own for long periods of time. I was moving from one plantation to another, and it was a mixture of green beans as well as tea. Early to bed, early to rise, lots and lots of manual labour. Dietary wasn't really a cross-section of a la carte. It was what you were given. And I realised really quickly how hard farming is in Africa, let alone farming. Here in Australia is tough, but you do it in third world. At that time, it was brutal. So people were very dependent on the rest of the chain doing their thing to support them, but it was an amazing period of time to be in Africa at that time and looking through and seeing how people were living as well.
And so how did your experience there sort of inform your understanding of the coffee supply chain? I mean, obviously you had some understanding of where coffee comes from and how it works and all that sort of stuff from your upbringing with your dad and your uncle, but what did your Africa adventure teach you about that?
The process is almost assumed. My father and my uncle had brokers in between that would do a lot of that sourcing for them and provide it to them. So they very much focused on that front end component, whereas I had a driving force to understand that at ground zero. Turning up and seeing what was ground zero was pretty tough. So it gave me an illumination around how hard farmers do it, let alone in any category it's pretty tough, but particularly in coffee where crop outcomes weren't guaranteed, frost was always a running risk, lots and lots of micro farmers who weren't organised enough to go into a co-op. So there were lots of opportunity for them to clean up their act. They just needed a helping hand to start sculpturing and providing a change. In some regards, RFA's done that, Fair Trade's done that, and a lot as an umbrella format to that. But for me, it was really, eye-opening to understand how tough it was.
Was that one of the reasons that you chose Africa as well? Because, when you got to that point and when I'm going to return back to Australia via doing this travel for a year.
Yeah. Actually,
you would have had options, right, of where you could go to. But
from my perspective, it was I'd made the decision around what was going to be the toughest route because I wanted to see it at really its core.
Yep.
Truth be told, in hindsight, I could have just gone to Papua New Guinea, which still has the same issues that we're seeing in I was seeing in Africa at that time. So I really wanted some hardship to understand how bad it can get before it can get better. Saying that, I saw the development. Well, we've seen it with Rwanda is a really good example of a country that then took coffee seriously and has, over the last 20 years, done amazing things.
So just jumping back a step, so you're in the UK.
Yep.
You're living the investment bank life, and you've thought, this isn't for me anymore. What made you decide to come back, or had you always planned to come back to the family business?
Yeah. I need to be careful with my choices around financial services, but you go through uni and you go into formalised steps, and my parents were migrants, and they always inspire you to do better, and for them, white collar was doing better, and I firmly believe that myself. But I was working alongside in the UK, and I was being treated really well, working hard, but I really missed making things, and from this perspective, it was making coffee. One of the things that happens when you start to get disillusioned is that you remember fondly of the previous life, and it just kept on coming back. How much I enjoyed working with my dad, how much I enjoyed working with coffee, and it just kept on repeating in my head. But you need to give things a go. So I figured 3 to 4 years, I would either have a career in financial services or I would dip out. But it was very clearly going one way, and I thought, well, it's time to move on.
So when you came back, did you have goals in mind of what you wanted to achieve? Because it's a very definite move, saying I'm going to change my career back into manufacturing.
Yep.
Did you have a plan in mind per se to go, I will achieve this when I get back? Or was it more like, I'm just going to go home and get into roasting coffee again and see what happens?
Yeah, and kick the footy. It's no, it was pretty clear agenda on what I wanted to do, and that was only because I had such a clear aperture from working with my dad and my uncle. So I knew that I had to speed up some of the progression that they were happy with leaving alone.
So you're talking about hauling the coffee manufacturing business into the 21st century, essentially.
Yeah, and that can be done from changing a dot matrix printer to just laser, and I don't miss the screeching. Yeah, it's like, wow, that's crazy. So there were all these immediate things I needed to do just to bring them up to speed. But at the same time, my father and uncle are of a certain age where they're saying, do I have an appetite for change? Do I really want to see this out? So at that time, my father and uncle started to talk about succession. It was only a few years after I had been there that they started to say, you know what, it's probably time that as a family we worked out what's going to happen next. And I'm very thankful that they gave thought to that, because it leads down a path that needs to be sorted out whilst everybody's active and capable of doing so.
So, I mean, succession in a family business, I'm sure, is not the easiest thing in the world. So what did that process actually look like? And perhaps what advice would you offer to others who might be going through a similar thing at the moment?
Yeah, it's I shouldn't laugh before I actually say something.
Yeah, that's
but you need to have an appetite for change. And whether that's small change or large, you still need to have an appetite. If you're, the second or third generation in place, or even the founder, you need to have an understanding that things will change and beyond your control. Nonetheless, we reached out to our the Family Business Association, the FBA network. We reached out to our accountants. They were fortunate enough to have done succession multiple times in other businesses. And you think your scenario is really unique. Oh, no, we're in coffee. We're unique people, migrants and all that. And then they give you a showcase of another 100 instances of exactly the same thing. So it's not new territory either, which is fantastic. So my clear suggestion around this is to bring in specific IP around succession and getting that assistance in place, because it makes that journey that much simpler. So we had a fairly I'd say expedited process around it, and it still took 2 to 3 years.
Right, really?
Yeah. It's everybody has a different scenario. You think you're talking about a platform, but in actual fact, someone's own viewpoint is a different. So you've got mixtures of methodology as well as priority. For some, one of my cousins just wasn't a priority for them. It's like, do as you see fit, whereas someone else had a vested interest. So the succession for us was one. Passing it over from the founders to the family, and then the second part to that was myself and Chris buying out the rest of the family. So it's just he and I. So
families are littered with personalities and emotions. How do you, whether it's in a succession situation or even fast forward skip 20 years of business and go to today where you're running this business with your brother-in-law.
Yep.
How do you sort of manage the personal dynamics versus the business dynamics? And is there a wall that you put up when you go home, or how does that work?
Yeah, from the succession period, I found that the greatest reward was having a mediator that wasn't connected to any one member, and it automatically it diffuses that competition or conflict that may come across. And saying something silly in front of a mediator sounds silly in front of a mediator. So I may smirk at it, but the mediator would say, "Well, let's review what that means," and so they got rid of a lot of that rubbish and a lot of that emotion. So I'm again thankful for that. As for Chris and I, it's a very different dynamic. So it's constantly talking about work. It's constantly talking about what we've got on and what we want to achieve. It's not actually firewalled off. It's just part of our relationship. It's part of our conversations. I'm really thankful for it. The same conversations that I have at home with my family. It's around the dinner table. This occurred. This is how we're going to deal with it. My good lady wife has a certain opinion. She's quite left in her component, and I've got 2 kids, and they're very vocal about what I should be doing on TikTok. So, it's I'm open for suggestions in that regard.
So, would you say that open communication is a way that you hold each other accountable for what needs to be achieved without destroying that personal relationship? Because obviously not everyone agrees on everything all of the time. To your point earlier, people have different opinions and views on things.
Yep. Transparency is really freeing. We'll talk about how we did that using technology, but it also applies to just general relationships as well. You avoid a lot of the conflict when it's clearly spoken, when it's clearly presented. I'm a big advocate for transparency, so it actually diffuses a lot of the problems that we have or some of the conflicts that we have. But there is a mechanism in place like a good organisation should have, which is to say what happens when we can simply not come to an agreement on something. You know, what are the processes beyond that? So when you deal with these right from the outset and you have a formula in place, it robs it takes away that conflict that can come out of it.
Yeah. We're on a podcast called Coffee Lab, and you run a series of coffee businesses, and we haven't yet really even mentioned the word coffee, and we've been talking for 10 minutes. So just to go through, the OG group and the arms of it, we've got Oasis.
Yep.
Tell us quickly what Oasis is.
So my father, Dennis, and Peter bought a little roastery in Burwood called Oasis Coffee. They were roasting coffee and pulverising it for Eastern market segments. Greeks, Turks, and the Eastern Europe, and it was one that they fell in love with because they were in hospitality. They ran a number of businesses. The last one they had was at the Southern Cross Hotel. They ran a restaurant there and realised we love hospitality, but we will never see our family. So how do we stay attached to it but still have a life that we can contribute to? So they felt that coffee was the next bastion of change, and they bought this little business called Oasis and grew it out of that. So we were fortunate enough. They built it to supply Coles, Woolworths, Independence. It's Australia-wide. It's number one here in Victoria, followed very closely in the other states. A little bit of export, but it's still a primary product within the staple, and it's one I love.
And when was that?
In the 70s.
1970s. Okay. And so then when did Griffiths Brothers enter the conversation?
We were fortunate that one of the coffee traders, Bill Bennett, had come to see my dad and uncle and said, look, there's an opportunity to buy a larger infrastructure that's already in place in Mulgrave, sunny Mulgrave for the rest of us. And they saw the opportunity as far as a production issue, as a roasting issue, not so much as a business issue. They didn't realise actually what they bought until much later, and I think it was Bill Bennett that said, lads, you just don't know what you've bought. And they've gone, what do you mean? It's right over there. And it's like, no, there's a greater sense to this than what you're seeing. So that was a Griffiths Bros component of it. And then they just merged the entities into Oasis Griffiths, which becomes foundation of the OG group.
Right. And Griffiths Brothers is food service, right? So who are you supplying as Griffiths Brothers?
Cafes, restaurants, hotels to a lesser degree, but it's very much around that food service, cafe environment. And
more recently, you've added Coffee Lab and also Dua. Tell me about those two. I've probably pronounced that incorrectly, but tell me about those two elements as well.
Yeah, and actual fact, how to pronounce it is on the pack. Dua. Right. So it's exactly that. It can be a tough one.
Yeah.
Coffee Lab is interesting. So we went through this process by which we modernised our infrastructure and went, you know what, we've got the ability to do things better than most, and that was the initial kickoff to say quality and the expertise that comes with it. And it grew into an entity called Coffee Lab where we could approach franchises or other roasters where they could come to us and we could provide them a finished product. And because we do such significant changes in packaging, it gives us a breadth of ability to do multiple things for multiple people, multiple businesses. It does have a minimum. So we can't do this on a micro level where it's a cafe. It's very much aimed at larger businesses. The Dwa one, Dwa Coffee is a much bigger pie. So we were approached by two Indigenous individuals. The CEO currently in place, Sean Andrews, runs that business. And we're very much the engine room around how coffee is created. They felt that the Indigenous opportunity was significant to break in to the Woolworths or to the grocery channel, and Woolworths was supportive of that. So we co-created a product for the grocery shelf. They already had the Dwa brand. We just added a lot of magic to it and created a high quality product, and we've kicked off from that. So that's been really interesting. Really eye-opening on how Indigenous communities work, how they're viewed by the greater Australia. So there's lots of learnings for our business along that channel as well.
So you spoke earlier about wanting to drag the business into the 21st century.
Yep.
And you've just covered off the different brands and units and sort of vertical integration that you've created within your group. But how else would you say that you've done that?
One of the things that from my perspective, that the business lacked, and I have to say it's probably an industry reflection as well, was a lack of transparency. You know, green beans come in, we do something to them, and you receive some brown beans. And I felt that there should be a better understanding from the consumer or an individual organisation about how we go about that process. So when people talk about technology, it can be an easy, I put something in the cloud or I did that. But in actual fact, for us, it was looking at all our processes and then placing a fixed understanding around it. So in the process of doing so, we built a platform called Quality Portal, and you can log into that and get to see how your bean has transformed from green and where it's come from all the way through the process and outcome to golden cup to see where that's gone. So one of the things I like about transparency, it gives control back to the initiator of that, whether that's under the Coffee Lab banner or a consumer at the shelf. I really like having the ability of showcasing where the beans are coming from and what we've contributed along the way, as against just being a roastery somewhere along the line. And hopefully it all works out okay.
And is that something that's sort of unique to your business or your group of businesses?
Yeah, I think it is. And the reason for that, I reached out to one of our roasting partner, which is Bombardier, and they build roasting systems in Italy. And I gave them this project line and all the outcomes. And I get a phone call from the owner, Fabrizio, and he says, what? And I go, what do you mean? And he said, I've never been asked for this before. Like, in actual fact, why are you doing it? And once I broke it down to him, he went, oh, yeah, I get it. But what outcome? What outcome do you get from that? It's nothing. In actual fact, the outcome is transparency. It's presenting what we do as a business. In actual fact, it showcases how we go about it, how much effort goes into coffee. Because you can produce coffee with a Bunsen burner or a gas bottle. It's not going to be consistent. It's not going to be great, but you could do it. I've seen popcorn makers. I built one. So in the early 2000s, I thought, you know what? I really love roasting. I want to build a lab roaster. So I welded a unit up, and I got 2nd-degree burns when I fired it up. It's
I shouldn't laugh. That sounds horrific.
Yeah, so I burnt my forearm, and my dad took me to the hospital. When you're a grown person and your dad still takes you somewhere, and he didn't say anything. He just kept on looking at me, and I went, "Oh man, he's going to give it to me straight." Like it's Nonetheless, he abused me in 2 languages, but yes, there's some comedy along the line.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like you're doing that almost for your own purposes. But what value do your customers derive from that transparency?
Yeah. So what I love about what we've done is how much information someone can garnish from it. So transparency is our process, great, but did you realise that from the ton of green beans that we source from Brazil, that after we cleaned it, we've lost 6 kilos? And they said, well, what do you mean you lost 6 kilos? Well, there was stone, bones, all those sort of bits and pieces, a lot of debris. We then converted, your roast profile requires us, your roast profile will then have a 16% loss. You're aiming for 12. The 4% variance is because of these reasons. All of a sudden, that information flow really empowers the individual that comes to us or the organisation that comes to us. And I've found it really quite gratifying when someone asks a query specific to the portal and they come away from it saying, wow, I'm better for it, as against just hoping that we transform it in the right way.
So transparency is super important.
Yep.
To you, to your organisation, and I believe that ties into sustainability as well, being transparent about sustainable initiatives. And I know that's something that's important to you, and not just talking the talk, but actually actively trying to minimise your impact as a manufacturer.
Yep.
But what are some of the key initiatives that you've put into place to reduce that impact?
Yeah. One of the things you can fall into a trap of doing is presenting sustainability and not actively walking it. And I think that's what you're asking me. So we looked at our process and some of the glaring bits and pieces around energy. And energy is a massive conversation at the moment and continues to be so. And I can't see that dissipating. So early on, we decided, right, we'll get solar panels on. And that's nice, but solar only works when solar is available. So that it's a contribution, and I think it's a wonderful way forward, but it can only do so much. From my perspective, I felt, how do we reduce our load? We're getting busier as an organisation, but how do we actually use less energy? So we made a decision that we would roll out inverters across all the motors. And an inverter for the average punter is something that controls the flow of power and output. So you don't have to start something at 100%. If you remember your old split system, your old condition, you turn it on, you hear boom, and it's like, man, I just Just, yeah.
I had to turn it off so I could hear the TV when we had one of those in our first place, and it was unbelievable.
My parents were never going to pay for aircon, I can tell you right now. But all of a sudden you put an inverter on it, it starts 10, 20, and it builds up to the capacity that's required. So we ran out all these energy couplings and inverters, and we saw an energy decrease, and I went, well, how do we then measure that? Like it's nice to know, but how do we measure that? So we rolled out a coupling system that you put on basically every conduit into the fuse box. Energy Australia helped us in that process, and it gives us real data about what energy is being pulled and where it's being pulled from. So I found it really interesting starting to get all these data from all these pieces of equipment. And it's things like, you've had a machine on and warming for 2 hours before it wasn't activated. Why was that? We wanted to heat the bars, or we wanted to do that, or we just simply didn't get around to it. We needed to be better at how we were managing our fleet of equipment, let alone the energy that we were losing from it. The other side of this is one of the outputs from roasting coffee is a husk, and that's a byproduct of the skin departing in its thermal reaction. We would fill industrial bins every week of just loose husk that was hard to combine and get rid of. So we made the decision that we would briquette it, which would reduce the volume of space in the first instance, and then we put in a system of pelletization where you can actually break that down into tiny pellets that you can put in through an auger into your fireplace. In this particular case, we'll be testing auger heaters for the city of Melbourne, where we can roll out the husk of that cafe then goes into the cafe heater, and see how that rolls through. So it's a nice 360 in its usage.
We talked about crop to cup before, but this is like way beyond cup now.
Yeah.
Like, so what do you call that? Crop to, I don't know. But like, this is a significant step, right? Like making something useful out of your waste product as well is, that's a fairly significant step in the way of, in the direction of sustainability.
Yep. And all the way through this, might I add, is we've had experts come in and assist us, some for no recognition or value, and a lot of people are willing to contribute towards change, particularly in sustainability, where, we need to be better at minimisation and we need to be better in reuse. We're part of APCO, which is a convention here in Australia in packaging, and moving to our 2025 expectation and goal. There's lots of activities happening. Some are quite large umbrellas, but on the localised, in our own business, we need to be better as well.
So particularly because of the pandemic, single use at cafe level has become the norm.
Yeah.
Right? How do you think cafes and hospitality institutions can be more wide agents of change? Like, what are some things that you think they could do? Because you're not just planting a tree to offset the activity in the roastery. You're actively trying to tackle it and minimise your impact.
Yep.
So what do you think some cafes and restaurants can do while trying to balance that side of it as well?
Yeah. One of the things my dad used to do, he would jump into the bin just before it got picked up on a Friday, and he'd take everything out to work out. Not because he was trashing stuff. He wanted to understand, why do we have this waste in the first instance? So some waste makes sense. Some waste was maybe 30 meters of a rewind or packaging. Why is that there? What have we done incorrectly? So there's a methodology there. He probably wasn't aiming for the sustainability component. He wanted to minimise loss, and in itself, that is a sustainable policy. The cafes will do a similar format. If they were to go through their trash at the end of the day and find out what's actually been thrown out, you'd be surprised at how much single use we're actively doing. One of the reasons we've got such apprehension, I feel, in making change, and the grocers will tell you the same, is they worry about the outcome. Is it going to be accepted? So I was speaking to a friend of mine who's Dutch, and he was part of that process when they got rid of the plastic bags, and he went, "Peter, that's happened 20 years ago in Holland." It's like, what? And he goes, "Yeah, it was, that was a bad accent, by the way." But, and he goes, "That was done 20 years ago. Like, why is it taking so long here in Australia?" And I said, "Well, we can dig really deep holes, like we're really good at landfill." So there has to be a change in methodology, and there's also going to be, I feel that there just has to be change, and people, you know what, you suck it up, you'll be okay. It'll be all right. How many of us have gone in and forgotten our bag at the car, and then you just jumble it up till you get back to the car and you're okay? You're not worse off for it. we just need to be a little bit more adventurous with some change.
It's so true. I remember when that was announced and everyone was acting as though the apocalypse had come. Everyone was, oh no, I can't, I'm going to have to carry my groceries in my hands if I don't have a bag. What will I do?
Yep. It's just some of the change is coming to us really quickly. CSIRO made it very clear that we are to accept distribution, manufacturing changes that are coming because of supply issues. It's going to get worse and worse. Let's start working towards a better outcome.
No business can affect, large scale change on its own in terms of the climate, even social change. How do you think that hospitality as an industry can potentially affect change, whether that's climate and sustainability or whether it's even social change? How do you think that the hospitality industry can play a more leadership role?
Yep. I feel that trying to do it on your own is actually really tough. I've seen it with our own business, how change is tough and how much resource it takes to do so. I really like cooperative effects. I really love cooperative approaches to things where it's not just my IP or my resource, it's everybody getting together and coming to consensus. I understand that can be difficult. But just like APCO as a convention, you can do similar in the industry of that. It just takes a few individuals to step up and say, let's make some change. And as soon as one of the larger groups initiates change, most people will follow. And that drags change. And it's not sponsored by the mum and dad operator. It's sponsored by larger operators taking the initiative to make that change. So I feel that cooperative is a good approach, an industry standard. It doesn't have to be overwhelmed in compliance. The IP is already there. You can lean out to the paper guys. You can lean out to the equipment guys and use their IP in starting to get some structure around it. It's not an easy task, but no task of value is easy.
And is that what kind of drew you to the DY project as well in some way? How does that kind of play into your thinking? Yeah,
so the Indigenous space, I have to say in the 18 months that we've been involved in it, it has grown exponentially, but also has our learnings along that level about how the Indigenous community is dealt with. So there's state-based, there's an Australian-wide component around the Indigenous space. We very much lean into our Indigenous partners about understanding their space and what we need to do to contribute to it. And sometimes it's not commercial decisions, and that's one of the things that's been hard for me to reconcile, is to say the right decision is a commercial one, but in actual fact, in this instance, it's not. I also found that some of the discussions with operators, they weren't really privy to what was happening in Indigenous space, and I just don't think we communicate that particularly well. There is information out there, but you need to seek it. This is the first time on a grocery shelf that someone can look at an Indigenous product and say, oh, shivers, that's actually being supported, and that actually change is coming in that way. That isn't done in a handout sort of format.
Yeah. But you also can't force change on a collection of people, can you? You sort of, they've got to be agents of their own change, right?
Very much. And economic freedom, economic ability to steer your own ship is one that is, quintessential to our life. So having the ability for the Indigenous community to then steer their own business initiatives is a really big piece.
Random question. So if you could give yourself a piece of advice, if you were, say you're 20 years old.
Oh, yeah.
You jump in a time machine, come forward and say, hey, Pete, tell me something that's been paramount that you've learnt in your career. What would that piece of advice be that you'll give yourself?
Yeah. This may sound corny, but passion's a massive thing. When you're passionate about something, it kind of flows. So I went through uni because that was expected of me, and I finished my degree and went, wow, what do I do now? So at 20 years old, I would have loved my future self to say to me, don't worry about outcomes in that regard. Find something you're really passionate in and chase it down. Chase it right down to the ground.
Would you have gone to university then? Did you go to uni because you this is what I should do in hindsight?
Well, it was expected of, Greek boys in the 90s or whatever that they were going to be a lawyer and accountant, right?
Oh, yeah. You didn't say doctor.
Sorry.
It's my parents are fairly progressive, so that was never on the card.
So you were allowed to be an investment banker then?
Yeah. There's another term my dad uses for that, but I have to say passion. So coming out of school, I think a gap year would have been absolutely really down my alley. I think it would have been a really good learning and maturity for me. And then and then look to whether I do tertiary, but look to do tertiary with a passion behind it, not just do tertiary because that's the expectations in place. I'll then say that the passion really built for me when I hit Africa and I saw the plantations, and I thought, wow, this could be it. I could be part of this chain. So it grew out from that, but it was a decade later. Whereas I could have been doing that a decade before.
Yeah,
passion might be one of them, but what's one of the more important lessons that you've learned along the way?
Yeah, detail is a big deal. So it's that there's always. I'm a big advocate of large strategies and then allowing someone else to work out the detail.
Every business needs at least one of those. Yeah,
one of those.
There's nothing wrong with that.
No, I'm saying it quietly so no one hears me. But you come to realise that a lot of business is process and detail. And as boring as it sounds, the process actually provides a couple of things. One, it gives a consistency in measure. It gives people a direction by which they can go, and then it allows the improvement to occur. So I'd like to think that both Chris and I recruit people under the OG group who can add value. It's not just repetition of tasks. Anybody can do that. In actual fact, AI and robotics will take over those tasks. What we're looking for is individuals that can come in and say, that's great, you've done a really nice job of it, but I think it can be a 30% increase here, or we could do this, or we could do that. That's what I really enjoy from that business component.
So to that point, if you could start a completely different business tomorrow, what would it be? Outside of coffee.
Yeah. It does it need to be commercial?
No, of course not.
By commercial, do you mean viable?
Yeah, actually, that is spot on, viable. My dream retirement is I'm going to be buying stuff off ads on TV. When they say, buy this shredder, or buy this gym, and I'm going to test it. I can't wait to just engineer it and then put a review. It's going to be wonderful. I really love the engineering side of it, and that's where I'm going with this. It's it would be a business that provides a solution around, I suppose, any environment of where things are bogged down, and we can get in there and re-engineer an outcome that works for that business. That'd be a lot of fun.
So a friction reduction business.
Friction reduction. Doesn't sound glamorous when you say that, though.
Gonna have to come up with a brand around that.
Yeah.
Get Coffee Lab on it.
Teflon. Yeah.
Peter, we're out of time, but and I'm sure we could have talked for hours, but thank you very much for joining us. It's been great learning a little bit more about your story.
Thanks very much, Tom. Greatly appreciated. Thanks, Dave. It's been a bit of fun. It's pushed me a little bit as well. Passion goes a long way. So, yeah, that's the outcome from that conversation.